tomato plant, most people think of a flowering plant. If you go out and look around outside, you'll see some plants that don't have flowers. And so what we want to look at on page 105, skipping ahead and then coming back, is actually how plants have evolved, and this word, diversified. How we have a huge diversity of plants, but because they're so similar, they probably had a similar origin. And so we want to look at the evolutionary path, and then we'll go back to finish the Sternger notes.
Okay. So according to the similarities and differences that plants have, we've actually classified them into 4 main groups. And these groups are going to represent those evolutionary relationships. And that's seen in this phylogenetic tree. So a little bit of a review of our last unit as well.
So if we stop and look at this phylogenetic tree, it shows us that branching off first is actually green algae. Remember, green algae is actually a protist. This is from kingdom Protista. It is eukaryotic, but it's called Protista. So the land plants are very similar to green algae, but they're multicellular. The next group of plants was mosses, and notice these branch off before vascular tissue. Vascular tissue, remember, is xylem and phloem. And then ferns branch off, and then we have seeds. So ferns have vascular tissue, but not seeds. And then gymnosperms branch off, and that's when flowering plants come into play. Flowering plants will also usually produce a fruit.
So the plants with the most sophisticated adaptations are actually going to be our angiosperms, our flowering plants. And those adaptations are going to help them survive and reproduce better. This is going to include that vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, the stomata, the flowering structures, and the seeds that you find in the fruit of the plant.
So we do want to be careful about the word adaptation and what it means. Remember, it's a trait that helps you survive, so it gives you increased survival. But it's also something you inherit. So every time you see the word adaptation, you want to think that it probably arose from a mutation that was then inherited. And one little quick way to remember that angiosperms are flowering plants is Angie is a girl's name. And girls like flowers. And so we are going to talk in class about why flowers have become an important part of human culture. But now we're going to go backwards a little bit to page 103 to finish up our notes about Sternger. So far we've done Sternger, and we have 2 R's to cover today.
Okay, so one of the first groups of plants we're going to talk about are the gymnosperms. These actually make eggs within the cone of the plant, so like we're pine trees. Okay, the pollen and also the pollen, the sperm of the plant, is also going to be found in that cone. Afterwards, the wind is actually going to help pollinate that plant, and that's going to fertilize our egg or the seed of the plant, which is stored inside the cone itself. And wind and animals are going to help disperse those seeds around.
So when we think about what a plant is, we know it's multicellular, we know it's eukaryotic, we know that it uses photosynthesis to self-feed itself. These plants that are going to grow really tall are going to have vascular tissue like xylem and phloem. They're going to do transport, they're going to do excretion, they're going to regulate their growth patterns. When they go to reproduce, they are all going to reproduce sexually. So they're going to make egg and sperm. And one thing we want to remind ourselves is that egg and sperm are both haploid. These are the gametes. So plants do perform sexual reproduction as well. But they can't find a mate. They can't get up and go find a mate. So they need a way to get the egg and sperm together. So gymnosperms are actually just going to use the wind. They're going to produce a ton of pollen, and the wind is going to help move the pollen around until it lands on the female cone, and then it will fertilize to make the seed. The seed gets stored in a different type of cone. Now, one way to remember this is I always think of the word gym, and I think of tough people being at a gym, people who go to work out. And so the cone is a pretty tough structure to protect the seed. Sometimes you'll see little squirrels pulling at the tough pine cone structure to pull the seed out. But gymnosperms don't have a flower. They're just going to produce the pollen and then store their seed in a cone. And if you've ever seen the little helicopter seeds moving through the air, that's a gymnosperm. That seed is just released, and we're hoping that with the wind and sometimes animals will help disperse the seed. So one way to reproduce.
Okay, so then we also have our next category of plants, the angiosperms. These are going to make sperm and egg on different parts of the flower. And so these flowering plants are going to depend on pollinators, like bees and birds, to spread the pollen, and the fertilized egg or seed is going to be stored in the flesh of the ovary of the plant. And animals are going to help disperse that after they eat the fruit.
So we want to just talk a little bit about what these structures actually are, and sometimes the name really helps you out. See the part of the word men here, stamen. This is the male part of the flower. So when you look at a flower, there are lots of things to actually notice. And we've been going through our lives thinking they're pretty and they smell good. Well, it turns out this is the sexual reproductive organs of a flower. So interesting to think about how humans use flowers to kind of attract someone. And so the petals are going to be brightly colored, but they're not really part of the sexual anatomy. They're not male, they're not female, they're not going to do photosynthesis. It is expensive for the plant to make these petals, so this is why flowers only bloom at certain times of the year. So we have these brightly colored petals to help attract the pollinator, like what Ms. Luong said. And then once the pollinator arrives, that's where we're going to have a little bit of the nectar here to help feed that pollinator. And so that's why the bird or the bee goes, to get little sips of the nectar. And as the pollinator is getting little sips of the nectar, it picks up some of the pollen on its body. And the pollen is made by the anther, and this is the male part. And so then the female part.
So the female part is going to be called your carpel. Oh, sorry, female. And there's actually three parts to the female carpel: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma right up here is where your pollen is going to be able to fall into the style, through the style, to the ovary, where we have our actual egg.
And one way to remember that these are the female parts is to connect all of these words to a female. There is sometimes a stigma or something bad about being a female. People will say, oh, you throw a ball like a girl, or you can't run as fast, you're a girl. So there is sometimes stigma to being a female. Females, hate to say it, definitely have more style than males on the most part. And we know females have the ovary. So if you can remember that these three words have to do with being a female. Now, we'll be careful about carpel because sometimes we'll actually see it called the pistil. Either one is sometimes used. And so the way I think of it is sometimes they'll tell girls to store a pistol in her car to help protect her. So that would be a question of whether you felt that was necessary. But the big thing is we will be able to identify the male parts, the female parts, and know that they're on the same flower. Some flowers will self-fertilize. This one can't. The pollen can't get up here onto the sticky stigma. And so this flower would require something to help it pollinate. And then the creepy thing is when you eat a fruit, you're actually eating a swollen ovary. What it's swollen with is swollen with sugar. So when we look at the ovary, a fruit is swollen with sugar.
So all the plant's actions are going to require energy just like animals do. And we're going to need the energy in the form of ATP. So going back to our previous unit with respiration, plants are also going to go through respiration. They can perform both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, all occurring in their mitochondria.
And so when we said that making a flower was expensive, it turns out this is one of the ways. Being able to collect all of those sugars, being able to make all of those structures will take energy. And plants will make food during photosynthesis, but they still have to break that food down. So when you see organic molecules, we want to write CHO, our carbohydrate. So the chloroplast is going to make a carbohydrate. The mitochondria will break it down to get energy so that the plant can do work. And so at this point, we've gone all the way through Sternger. We've gone from a seed all the way back to a seed.